they're getting ready to transfer or jobs that they may be wishing to apply to while they're still in school. So those skills are important to have, not just outside of college, but also while you're still there. So I'm curious, want to know a little bit more about each of you. So I'm going to take a couple minutes, let you introduce yourself. That way I can kind of start to learn names a little bit. And then hopefully today, as we go along, I can kind of tailor maybe some of what I share with you to your interests and such. So
yes, my name is Jason Molina. I am the Vice President here at the Political Science Club. I'm also the President of the SGA Club. The SGA Club is that club? Secretary of Astronomy. It's like astrology, but it's astronomy.
Astronomy, okay.
Yeah.
Those are two a little bit different, right?
From there, I'm really just occupied with either like my studies, anything that's required, like meetings I have to go to attend, and anytime I talk to people in regards to like the political science club or whatever I'm doing. Sometimes I'm not just in political science club. I'm like, hey, like I got to study physics. Here's how I'm learning it. Here's the material, and there you go.
So what are you hoping to do long term?
Long term, I realized that administration seems pretty cool actually, and it's really interesting to like use my skills now as like that guy who kind of hits people up and says, hey, like I'm having a meeting, I have a study room available, you're welcome to come in and study whatever you want to study. It's usually like guiding a lot of the things that I do to me and my friends.
You're kind of looking at something more administration type position.
Right.
Okay, very nice. That's nice to meet you, Jason.
Thank
Sounds like you're a very busy person.
Hi, my name is Resonate, or you call me Ray.
Nice to meet you.
I'm a history major, and also I'm the treasurer of the club. And my dream job that I want to pursue, work for the United Nations.
Oh, wow. That's neat.
Yeah.
So what inspires you to want to work for the United Nations?
I mean, I like to listen to a lot of people's point of view and thoughts and what we can fix, what we can do better as a nation, and we can work out with other foreign nations as well.
Yeah, communication and listening in particular are super.
I love projects too, so like.
Well, hey, there you go. That's awesome. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, my name is Brian Dennis. I'm the president of the Political Science Club.
Nice to meet you, Brian.
Nice to meet you too. Major-wise, I'm majoring in political science, but I'm not entirely sure what I want to do job-wise. I wanted to major in poli-sci because of the conversations that you can have with people, specifically nowadays, how I guess you could say volatile conversations around certain pieces of political topics can be, and I found it interesting at how polarized things have become. So I like taking a moderate stance to kind of bring both pieces together in a conversation. So,
Kind of find that common ground, right?
exactly. So I enjoy being in there and just having those sorts of discussions. I don't know what job that would really.
There's all sorts of jobs out there that deal with finding that common ground and being able to mediate and work with people. And I think ultimately that's what employers look for, are people who can work well with others. So that's definitely a useful skill to have in a variety of different fields, not necessarily just one or the other, but yeah, absolutely. And then we have a few people joining us online.
Yeah, so we have Sophia
Okay.
and Saul.
Awesome.
Sophia or Saul, would either of you guys like to turn your microphones on and let us know what your major is and what your political aspirations are?
Hi, my name is Sophia, and my major is nursing, and my goal would be to reach my NP degree, so my nurse practitioner, and just be kind of like as a leadership position. That's just it.
Awesome. That sounds like a great field to go into. We definitely need more people with experience in healthcare, and certainly there are many different leadership positions available within nursing.
Saul, how about you? Do you want to turn your microphone on and tell us your major and your professional aspirations?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not feeling too great. But this is my first year in college, and I'm trying to get into the medical assisting program to go further into the medical field. I'm not yet decided whether it's in radiology or nursing.
Welcome. We're glad to have you. We have someone else who came in to our class, so would you introduce yourself?
I'm CSC, major in professional aspiration. My major in pharmacology. You know, help the people, help the community.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. We definitely need more people like that in the world. It's nice to meet you. So for those who are just joining us, who may have missed my introduction at the beginning, my name is Brittany Jeffrey. I teach English here on campus. And I'm here to talk today to you about resume building, because that is such an important skill to have as you're going through college, and certainly as you start pursuing your first job. So I want to share with you a couple things that I think will be helpful for you. And there's a handout for you that has a resume checklist and resume checklist. And so I want to just kind of walk through it, because how many of you have actually done a resume before? Okay, usually by this point, I find that students have done at least a resume or have the start of one. Maybe they haven't finished it exactly, but they've at least started on it. So I want to go over just a few things that I feel like are helpful to students. This is actually courtesy of one of the textbooks that we occasionally use in our English 2311 class. Paul Anderson provides this as part of his textbook. So it's really kind of helpful to have. I feel like my students really appreciate having access to it, because it helps them in kind of guiding their thoughts and all the information that they need to include in their resume. So what I tell students first is, oftentimes when you're working on creating a resume, you kind of have in mind, maybe, the type of job that you are looking for. And so what I encourage students to do is go do some research, find out a little bit more about the field that you're interested in exploring and being hired in. So that research can be anything from talking to someone in the field. It could be doing a Google search and learning about companies that work in that given field. It may be a case of finding a mentor and working with them. It could be a variety of different things, but do some preliminary research so that you know a little bit more about the field. You know what the common expectations are in terms of types of jobs out there, in terms of what types of skills employers are looking for. All of that is important to have kind of some prior knowledge before you get started actually working on your resume. You could send out a million different resumes, but if they're not targeted towards the particular field you're wanting to go into, chances are an employer will say, that's not really who I'm looking for. So do a little bit of preliminary research. So you'll notice there that first bullet point, determine as exactly as possible what the employer wants. So initially your search may be a little bit broader. You may just know, hey, I want to go into software engineering. And so you may have kind of a general idea of what you want to look for, et cetera. But you really need to kind of hone in on what those employers are looking for. What types of skills, what types of experiences, what types of education is it that they expect to see when they're reviewing resumes and application letters. So you can start kind of broad, but then as you get a little bit further along, start narrowing that focus. So let's say, for example, you find a company that you're like, oh my gosh, they have my dream job. Then you want to go in and you want to look at that particular job posting much more specifically. Look and see what some of those keywords are that they're looking for in terms of experience, in terms of characteristics of an employee, and then try to remember that when you get ready to start drafting your resume. And it's really important that when you apply for jobs, you want to tailor that resume and that application as much as possible. Why do you think that is? Why is it important to tailor it to a particular employer?
So that, you show that you care.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So let's say, for example, I'm an employer and I get a resume. And oftentimes when we get resumes nowadays, it can look very different. It may oftentimes be like this on a screen when we're looking at reviewing resumes. Other times it could be a hard copy. Maybe someone handed us a resume and said, hey, I know somebody who would be good for this position. But either way, our first introduction to any prospective employer or employee rather is the resume and application letter. Okay, so yes, absolutely. We want to see that you care, see that you've taken some initiative to learn about the company, to learn about what our needs are, and then have tailored that resume accordingly. Okay. Then of course the name and contact information. So let me give you a few little tips on this. When you're in college, and especially if any of you are planning to transfer, chances are you're going to have more than one mailing address. Okay, if you're still, living at home with mom and dad, but yet you go off to school to UT or A&M or U of H downtown, whatever, you may have two separate mailing addresses. So if that's the case, be sure you include both. That way, any future employers know, hey, I'm dealing with a college student who may be kind of out of pocket. Things may or may not be, getting to them if I send it via snail mail. I need to verify which address to send it to. So just be aware of that. It's perfectly fine to use two addresses on your resume. You just want to indicate maybe which one is your permanent address and which one is your college address. You'll notice on there it says to include how to reach you by mail, phone, and then a professional sounding email. I cannot stress this enough. I know in different positions I've worked in, I've had some good laughs at some of the email addresses that I've seen on applications and such. I'm thinking about one that I saw many years ago, like hot, spicy Latin lover. And I'm like, oh yes, that's
the working professional.
That's the working professional I need for this position. So, you probably want to, maybe do away with your childhood pet name that you had, that or nickname that everybody called you. Maybe not the most appropriate. So, just think about what your email address is. Oftentimes it's best if it's just your first and last name or first middle initial last name, something like that. Then also I would caution you, if you have maybe a more unusual name, you might want to just kind of think about that in terms of, is it going to be more challenging for an employer to try to get your name spelled right? For me, the way my name is spelled, Britney, people all the time misspell Brittany, they all the time misspell Jeffrey. So that might also be a consideration for me of like, hey, do I want to take a chance of maybe missing an email from someone because they didn't take the time to pay attention to how to properly spell my name? So just kind of think about that, but definitely try to have a professional sounding email address. That's going to go a long way with impressing employers. So an objective, when we're talking about an objective, how many of you have seen resumes that have an objective at the top? Okay. Oftentimes it's just that one little sentence. Sometimes you'll even see an objective that has maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences. They don't need to be that long. Usually one sentence, fairly short, fairly to the point. You want it tailored though to that particular position. Let's say you want to go to school and be a doctor. Okay. You don't necessarily want to say, my objective is to help people in the medical field. Okay, that's way too broad. Okay, you want to be much more specific. You also don't want to say something like, I want to find a great place where I can grow. Okay, well, we all do, right? So you want to just kind of think about how that objective should be. Try to tailor it as much as possible to that particular position. And also think about how you can craft it such that it makes it clear to your employer that you have something that you can offer, some need that you can fulfill that maybe is lacking for them in their company. For your education, This is where you're going to talk about your school, your major. Students always ask me, do I need to include my GPA? That's a great question. And I always tell them it depends. If you're going into a field where it's going to matter, sure, go ahead and include your GPA. Some students are like, what if my GPA is really bad? Do I have to include it? No, not necessarily. Chances are though, at some point your employer, if they have to see transcripts or something, they will eventually see it. Or they may ask you about it just to kind of get a sense of what type of student you are. So keep that in mind. There's a couple different ways you can list your GPA on your resume. The main thing is just be very transparent about what it is that you're listing. I've seen on resumes where students will list their cumulative GPA. So everything from day one when they started in college all the way till they graduated. I've seen where people have listed it where it's their GPA in their major. And so just the last couple of years of their college experience, I've seen where they've had it listed, hey, this was my GPA at my community college, this was my GPA at my university. So there's several different ways you can go about it. I would say if you have a GPA that you're proud of, go ahead, put it on there. If you have one that maybe you're like, oh, there's some room for improvement, that's okay. You can certainly include it if you want, or you can leave it and just wait for them to ask, or you can volunteer that information in an interview. It really just depends. And I always tell students, a number, yes, it's important oftentimes for some employers, depending on what field you're going into, but oftentimes it's also a conversation starter of like, hey, yeah, I only had a 2.8 GPA, but I was working 40 hours a week and I was raising a family and I was doing this and that. And so yeah, 2.8 was like the best I could do given my circumstances. So just kind of keep that in mind. A lot of times too, employers don't necessarily want to see a 4.0. Maybe they want to see someone who's struggled a little bit and what it is that they've learned. So just kind of keep that in mind. Of course, what I usually recommend for students who are coming straight out of school, start your resume with your educational background. That way it's clear to employers that, hey, I'm just graduating from school, I'm just starting out. A lot of jobs will say that they're looking for someone with 1 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years of experience. Oftentimes, even if you don't have a year, even if you don't have 3 years of experience, those are still considered entry-level jobs. So you can still certainly apply to them. You never know what might happen. So it's fine though that if you start with your graduation date. Oftentimes when you're applying for jobs, you're still in school, right? So what I encourage students to do is if you haven't graduated yet, just put on their anticipated graduation date. That way an employer knows, hey, I'm still in school, but this is when I should hopefully be available or completed my degree plan. And then of course, what are some other things that you can think of that might be helpful to include for education that employers might be interested in?
Certifications.
Yeah, certifications, absolutely. A lot of times while we're still in school, we're working on other things besides just our degree plan. We're getting those certifications that'll help us out in the workforce. What else?
Club activity maybe?
Yeah, club activities. Why would that be important?
Because it shows them like what we were like at that time at the like school, at that college, what we were doing. What did we participate in?
Okay.
Did we participate in the club?
Absolutely. And that even goes back to what I was just talking about a moment ago about the GPA, right? You might have a 4.0 GPA, but if you haven't been involved in anything else, and then you have somebody else who comes along who has, let's say, a 3.5, but they were, president of this and member of that, and this and that, which one do you think the employer might be more interested in talking to? Probably the 3.5, right? They come across as a more well-rounded person. Okay, so keep that in mind too. So yes, absolutely. Certifications, clubs or organizations. What else?
Volunteering, that's one big one.
Yep, volunteering. Absolutely, absolutely. What about your coursework? When might you want to include coursework? Yeah, absolutely. If it's related to the job you're applying to, okay. If you have a really specialized course, when you get to like your junior and senior year, it might be a case that you've had a chance to do an internship. It might be a case that you've worked on some sort of special project, or you've worked with your school through some sort of grant program. So that's something else that you can definitely include in there as well, just to kind of show like, hey, I'm involved. I've been working on this as well. If you've had any special scholarships, any other type of honor, you've been on the dean's list, all of those things are definitely worth mentioning as well. So I would encourage you to do that. Now, keep in mind when we're talking about coursework, like you don't want to include like, hey, I took freshman comp. Everybody took freshman comp, right? Or, hey, I had to take college algebra. Okay, well, you know, think about which courses really make you stand out from the competition. Which ones are going to be fascinating and really maybe more of a conversation starter, or that really kind of demonstrate like, hey, I have experience with this, I have knowledge of it, etc. So kind of think about that as well. You guys have any questions so far about this part?
Volunteer work, that's like anything volunteered off and on campus, like just any.
So absolutely, I would encourage you, any type of volunteer work you have, list it. Now you can certainly, hi, come on in. You can certainly, here you go, include, just fine. You can certainly do like a section that is strictly like organization, like campus club, student activity type volunteer work. And then you can also have a separate section, like let's say you volunteer with like your church, or just, you know, you go and volunteer on the weekends with the SPCA and it's not tied to any other organization, you could still have a separate section for that. Yeah, good question. Good question. So education, that's going to be a super important section that you're going to want to really kind of make sure you have closer to the top of your resume, especially when you're first graduating. And then for work experience, how many of you have worked at some point in your college career already? Okay, still working. All right, so work experience, definitely what I would encourage you to do. Some of you may have job hopped a little bit more than others. So I would think about which experiences are gonna, you know, be most relevant to what it is that you're looking for. Let's say you've, you know, over the past 5, 6, 7 summers, let's say you've held total of like a dozen different jobs. Do you want to list every single one of those on your resume? Probably not. You know, if you only stayed somewhere a month or 2 months, probably not. If you've been there for a year or longer, go ahead and include it. Because at some point you do kind of start running out of space. Okay. Something we didn't talk about earlier is when you think about your resume too. So let's say, for example, we're talking about a hard copy resume, okay? When I have a hard copy resume, the part that I'm gonna look at is really just kind of that top third. So you wanna make sure that top third has all the the most important information as possible. So if it's your education that's really stellar, that's where you wanna have that information, okay? For the objective, for me personally, I can take it or leave it, but I know for some fields they prefer it. So I would leave that up to you, but usually your objective is one of the first things up there because it does kind of help identify what type of position you're looking for. But going back to work experience, the main thing is once you've identified which work experiences that you plan to include, you want to be consistent with how you convey that information to your audience, okay? So you want to be sure you include the name of the employer, their location. I would include city and state just so that it's there, so that there's no question, especially if it's something that's like a national company or something, and just so that it's really clear for them. And then be sure you include your dates of employment, okay? For some of you, it may be that you've worked for the same employer for a long period of time, but it's been staggered, like over summer vacation or winter break or whatever. That's perfectly fine. Just include that in there. You can make a note about it. You can add those dates because I think it is helpful for employers to see, oh, hey, this person was committed to this company over a period of time, not just, you know, yeah. So definitely kind of keep that in mind. There's nothing wrong with showing that, like, hey, I just worked there in the summers, or I just worked there on as time was available, etc. Okay. When you're thinking about your work experience as well, keep in mind you want to use action verbs when you're describing your experience. Okay. And action verbs really kind of show that, hey, I was actively participating. I was actively doing these things. Don't just say was manager of Taco Bell, managed Taco Bell, etc. So think about that. Think about anything in particular that makes you stand out from someone else who was in that position. No, of course, you don't want to lie about your experiences or anything like that. We still want to be ethical. But think about what experiences did you have that are maybe a little more unique, that you feel like would perhaps be beneficial to that particular position for which you're applying. And remember, again, you want to kind of tailor this to the needs of this prospective employer. So think about what things in previous jobs might really kind of stand out. Like, hey, did you manage people? Were you involved on a team? Were you responsible for working with a small group of children? Like what is it in particular? Okay. If you had any particular programs, equipment, things like that, that you feel like were super helpful, that apply to the field that you're going into, certainly mention those as well. But really more than anything, you want to show that you're a good communicator, that you're a team player, that you have knowledge and skills that are going to benefit and meet the needs of that employer, and maybe even fill a void that they're currently experiencing. For activities, so this is where we kind of get into more of that, organizations, clubs, etc. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be tied directly to school. It could be something you've done with your church. It could be something like a service organization in the community that you volunteered for. It really just kind of, depends on what you want to consider as activities. But try to provide as much detail as possible. When you're working on your resumes, you want to bullet point all of these items so that the information's there. It's quick and easy to look at. But provide as much information as possible. So let's say you're involved. Hey, come on in. Sorry. No, come on in. So let's say, for example, you are involved in a student organization on campus. Okay. You're going to want to be sure that you include, hey, this was at Lone Star College Sci Fair. Okay. You want to be very specific. You want to include the number of years that you were involved with it. If you held any particular position, if you were the treasurer, if you were the president, if you were just a member, that's fine. Include that information. That way it's clear to your employer as well. And it shows them what type of experiences that you've had, kind of helps them understand how you're maybe a more rounded person because of that. And then if you have an opportunity, it really just kind of depends on if you have space. You can always include some of your personal interests. Now, I will caution you about this to some extent, because sometimes your personal interests, depending on what they are, people may have preconceived notions about them, and so it could actually work against you instead of help you. So just kind of think about that. Not that you have to hide anything, but just be aware that sometimes people are judgmental and not always the best way. So think about that. If you have room to include your interests, certainly this can be kind of a conversation starter when you get ready to go in for an interview. They're like, oh, hey, you like skydiving? Cool. Tell me about skydiving. Other times, it may not necessarily be relevant, or it may not necessarily be something you want to share. That's completely up to you. And then references. This is a really important part, because references oftentimes can make or break you. I had a friend a number of years ago. She was wanting to get in and work for a law firm, a really big law firm here in Houston. And she sent in her application, she sent in her resume, but she forgot to mention to one of our friends that she had listed her as a reference. And that friend was overseas for a few weeks on vacation and just was ignoring phone calls, ignoring emails, because she was on vacation. She was not going to be bothered by anybody. And in the meantime, she missed a phone call from that law firm calling to check up on her friend. And so she never got back to them. And so they decided to go on to another candidate. So make sure before you list someone as a reference, make sure you've talked to them, said, hey, is it okay for me to use you as a reference? And if you kind of know like how soon you plan to apply, or if you have any idea of like, hey, they may call you in the next week or the next month, it's always good to give people a heads up. That way they can be prepared. So that, they're expecting phone calls. They answer that random phone number that comes in and don't just think it's spam. So definitely make sure you okay those references ahead of time. Think about people who can speak to your strengths, who can give a accurate description of what your abilities are. You want to really kind of try to avoid personal references as much as possible. I usually tell my students, of course, if you've never worked, if you've never, had an employer, that type of thing, it may be a little bit harder to try to get a reference who's not a personal friend or family member, etc. Think about teachers, think about club advisors, think about, someone else that maybe saw you do volunteer work at church or in the community somewhere, whatever the case may be. Try to find references that can speak to your abilities besides just, hey, I've known this person since they were 3 years old. And I think if you do choose someone like that, I was actually a reference just about this time last year for a really good friend of ours. I've known him since he was 2 years old. He just graduated with a business degree and was looking for a job. And he's like, can I please use you as a reference? And I was like, well, what about one of your professors? I gave him all sorts of options. He's like, no, I have them too, but I need a personal reference for this particular job. And so if that's the case, just make sure that whoever it is can speak to both your strengths and weaknesses. And I think that was the concern when his employer called to ask me questions. I'm like, nope, I can be unbiased. I can tell you what his strengths are. I can tell you what his weaknesses are. And I think that was definitely appreciated. Be sure you include that person's title and where they work so that they kind of know who they're dealing with, if it's a past supervisor, if it's a professor, if it's a club advisor. Having that title, having that company or institution name is super, super important. And you want to just be consistent with how you convey that information. If you have an email address for one, you should have an email address for all. If you have phone numbers listed, same thing. Okay, just be consistent with how you share that information because it's going to show that you were paying attention to all the tiny little details that are important. And then in terms of actually just putting your resumes together, I mentioned earlier, you want to think about using action verbs. That's going to be important. You want it to be professional. You want to have a very polite, very professional tone. I can't stress to you enough how important it is. Take the time, go back, proofread. Look for minor little things, capitalization errors, punctuation errors, spelling errors, different fonts. You don't want to have 15 jillion different fonts and colors and this and that. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a committee, not just here, but in the corporate world as well, where we would take a look at a resume and be like, nope, too many errors. They didn't bother to take the time to proofread. Or, oh my goodness, wow, 27-point font just for their name. And then everything else is like super teeny tiny. So just, pay attention to those little things.
What would be the best font for you to see?
Usually I suggest either Times New Roman or Arial. They're very easy to read. And if you think about it, like when we're talking about MLA or APA or Chicago style, we're talking about easy to read fonts, right? So think about the fonts that you would use for like an assignment in school, similar type of thing for a resume. Yeah, great question. And I usually recommend 12-point is usually the smallest. You could go as small as 10, but I usually would say save that for folks who have just lots and lots of job experience. Usually 12-point is a good font. And if you just don't have a lot of experience, don't feel like you have to enlarge it to like 22. It's okay to have a little bit of blank space. It's better than, being glaringly different than everybody else's resume. For visual design, I think this is where students sometimes want to be super, super creative, and that can be really fun and awesome to play around with. However, you need to know your field. I recommend, when I talked earlier about doing preliminary research, this is where it's super important. Go and look and see what a resume looks like in the field that you're applying to. Okay, if you're going into something that's much more creative, yes, they're probably going to expect you to have maybe color or different fonts or this or that. If you're going into something that's much more traditional, much more business oriented, it's probably going to need to be fairly fairly simple. I can think of a few times where I've worked with students where they've applied and they've actually had to include like a headshot on their resume, and that was just what was expected in that field. So make sure you know what the expectations are for the field. That makes all the difference. And of course, just think about things that stand out to your employer that, you know, are going to really speak highly of your abilities. Be careful with how you use bullets. If you use little round bullets in your first two sections, don't suddenly shift to square bullets. Okay, just be as consistent as possible. And then ethics, this is always the most important part. Always make sure that what you're putting on your resume is truly accurate. I can't tell you how many times I've been in hiring committees where someone has said one thing on their resume and then told us something completely different in an interview, or we've seen a GPA on an application, and then later when we get the transcripts and we start looking, oh, the person didn't actually have the GPA that they claimed they had, or didn't actually have the coursework that they claimed they had. So be honest about your abilities. If you've worked with a team, by all means, highlight the fact that you worked with a team. Employers love seeing that people can work well with others. You know, if you don't want to take sole credit for something if you haven't done it entirely yourself. And then just also be careful about how you word things. I know sometimes we get a little bit creative to beef up our abilities on our resumes. You just need to be super cautious about that. You want to make sure that you're not misleading anyone to think that you're capable of doing something or you have done something that you haven't actually done, because I promise you at some point it will come back to haunt you. So any questions about resumes? A lot of information, I know.
Might seem like a pretty odd question, but you're talking about looking at resumes that have been submitted in the field that you're interested in. Is there like, could you just like Google search like resumes that have been accepted in?
You can. You can search for particular fields, resumes in engineering or resumes in nursing, etc. What you can also do is, if you're a member of like one of those professional organizations in that particular field, oftentimes you can network and you can talk to other people and be like, hey, can I see your resume? Can I get some ideas, etc. Also, what I would encourage you to do, check out the Career Center at your college or university. Oftentimes they can show you samples of good, effective resumes before you start applying for jobs. They can also work with you. A lot of times they have resources. I actually had a file I wanted to share with y'all today, but too many of the links are a little bit out of date from this past semester when I taught TechCom. But there are a lot of times college and universities, their career centers have excellent resources for taking a look at samples and such. So, yeah. Other questions?
Oh, and how long is your resume supposed to be?
Good question. So a general rule of thumb is for a resume, it should be a single page, one-sided. Okay. So when I told you a few minutes ago that when we look at resumes, if we have it printed off, or even when we're just looking at it on screen, usually we're just kind of focused on that top third. So oftentimes before we ever get further down, we've already kind of started formulating an opinion of, yes, I'm keeping it. Things are a little bit different now than what they used to be. Oftentimes we use software to search resumes. Oftentimes HR directors or other HR folks kind of preview resumes and then decide, yes, this person's qualified, no, this person's not qualified. And so oftentimes the hiring manager doesn't even get to see the whole pool of candidates. So just kind of keep that in mind. That's where also, if you're tailoring your resume and you use some of those keywords that are in the application, if those stand out, especially if you've included an objective and you say something about, something that was in that job description, it's going to get flagged. Okay, that's a keyword we're looking for. Let's hold on to that one, or let's set that one aside. Most employers, if they're actually looking at hard copy resumes, I would say spend 10 to 20 seconds just glancing at a resume before they decide keep or so single page. You can certainly provide, when you go to an interview, a much longer, more detailed resume if you need to. And if you're short on space, what I would suggest is attach your references as a second page. That way your first page is simply important information. Yep. Questions?
With regarding cover letters,
Mhm.
so, because I do understand for a lot of jobs, they have to have, like, you have to have a cover letter right next to it.
Yeah.
So basically, you just kind of like write a little bit of, kind of like saying thank you for the opportunity or something.
So usually kind of a rule of thumb. So if you take a look at that next page, that's their job application letter or job application letter, cover letter. So usually what we want to do, again, do a little bit of preliminary research about who your audience is that you're addressing this to. When possible, you want to address it to a specific individual. Now, oftentimes we don't always know who that hiring manager is. Sometimes you can pick up the phone and call and ask. Sometimes if you're applying online, who knows? Rule of thumb, just put hiring manager is a good safe bet.
I have created one. Kind of like when it like stock the company.
Mhm.
And then stock it over there and like actually find the HR manager.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you can find that, and that's great if you can include that information. Yeah. If not, you can just do something more generic. The main thing is in your introduction, you want to tell them specifically what position it is you're looking for. Okay. I know here in our department on campus, the English department, for a while, we were separated between credit and transitional studies. And so when we would get resumes, we would have to go, oh, is this for somebody wanting to teach credit, or is this which adjunct posting or which full-time posting is this for? So when possible, you always want to include that job posting number or that title that you're applying for. That's super helpful. And try to persuade your reader just in that first paragraph of why you're interested, why it is that you want to work for that company. So kind of an introductory paragraph of, hey, I'm interested in this position. This is what I hope I can, contribute to the company, and then jump into your qualifications. Okay. There's an example here of what that might look like. So this one is, I'm writing to inquire about a possible summer internship opportunity. So state specifically what it is. It may be that there's not even a job posting. You're just hoping that there's something out there. So tell them what it is that you're looking for. Maybe you know someone who works there. You can name drop a little bit. Don't get too wrapped up in that though. But then once you've done that, jump into your qualifications. And this is where I tell students you have to be super specific. Okay. There are tons of people who are out there who are, nursing majors. Okay. So what makes you different from everyone else? Provide specific examples of things you've done in class. Provide specific examples of how you volunteered or whatever the case may be. Try to be as specific as possible because that makes you stand out more than just, hey, I have a degree in nursing. Okay. So try to explain some of your knowledge, some of your abilities, some of your experiences, what you've learned. It's always good if an employer can see that you've kind of been a little bit you've incorporated a little bit of reflection about what you've learned from a particular experience. And then of course, towards the end, you want to also talk about like, hey, this is our next step. What is it that I want from you? I hope to hear from you soon to get a call for an interview, or I look forward to discussing my abilities, etc. So some sort of follow-up. Again, proofread. Especially being in the English department, I can't tell you how many applications we weeded out alone just because the grammar was so poor or lack of attention to detail on, the layout, the design, the content, etc. Just be careful of that. And again, same thing with the resume. You want to be as ethical as possible with what you're claiming that you have done or can do. Questions about the application letter? I've had some really good questions so far. Let's take a look at an example of a bad resume.
mine up there. Probably be the best.
So let's take a look at this one. What do you see might be a problem with this resume? Let's look just at the top little bit.
Very simple.
Okay, it's very simple, not necessarily a bad thing.
But her phone number's not on there.
Okay, we have no phone number. What else are we missing? No email address. You think she's gonna be waiting by the mailbox every day to get a letter from this employer?
No.
No, they're gonna move on. Like, nope, not even an option. We're gonna keep going. Okay, so definitely need to include more contact information. Yes, the objective is a little weak. To obtain a great nursing job with opportunities for advancement. Pretty general, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what type of nursing? Are we talking pediatric? Are we talking working in the ER? Like what? Are we talking about beginning nursing? Are we talking about someone who's looking for more of like a leadership position? We have no idea, okay? We don't know if this is like in a clinical setting, if this is in a hospital, if this is telemed, yeah, school of nursing, we have no idea, okay? So be much more specific. We see there Bachelor of Science in Nursing. We see the University of St. Catherine. Do we know where the University of St. Catherine is? Nope. So be sure you include that city, that state. We see the GPA. Okay, clinicals, what do we notice here?
It's still going.
Okay.
Very general, like to work.
Okay, so we see some examples of clinicals that she's been involved with. Okay, but not necessarily just a whole lot of detail. If you look up here, you'll notice present is lowercase here, but then down here we have it capitalized. So again, that consistency. Proofread, pay attention to details. Employers like people who pay attention to details. Save some money, keeps them out of trouble, all sorts of good stuff. Okay, if you look at this next part where it says experience, okay, we see she's included the place where she works, the city, the state, the dates, but notice her bullet points. She has some that are past tense with ed, we have some that are ing. Okay, we don't have consistency. And she says she's still currently there. So if you're talking about a position where you're still currently working, that should be present tense, unless it's a project or something that you've already completed while you were there in that time. Okay, so think about your verbs. They should be present tense. They should be active verbs. If you look down to that next section, so the first section we had verbs. Suddenly we have that first bullet point, supervision and support. Okay, so then we have a noun. Okay, so you want to be consistent. Supervised and supported. Okay. So think about that. And then let's take a look down here. Well, actually, look at the number of bullets she has. So she has 4 there for her first experience, and then 3, and then 2. You want to try to be consistent. So if you're doing 3 bullet points, do three bullet points for each one as much as possible. Okay. And then let's scroll down. Let's look at our references. Hey, what do you guys about these references?
Still no email.
Okay. Yep. Still no email.
One's missing a phone number.
One's missing a phone number.
Misspelling of TJ Maxx.
Yep. Proofread. Can't stress that enough. If you proofread nothing else, at least proofread your resume. Please, please, please. Okay. Does this kind of help to see what we're looking for?
Because when I had to do my first resume for like a job, it was very hard because I had to like look it up online to see, and I was just like, okay, it's just too many resumes. How do you do this?
How do you, yep.
So it was like really much. It's too much. It was not enough guidance to when it came to like
Yep.
doing a resume.
You could search for hours and days and weeks and months looking at resumes online. There are tons out there. But being able to distinguish between what is a good one and what is a bad one is super important. And that's why I wanted to give you guys this checklist today, because I think this definitely kind of helps see like, oh, I need to go and check that. Oh, I need to go and do this. So absolutely. Absolutely. Other questions? Other thoughts?
Where would you learn the vocabulary to have that professional tone that you mentioned earlier?
So that's where looking at resumes in your field could be super helpful. Oftentimes just going and looking at companies and looking at the postings that they have for positions, you can kind of get a feel for a company as well as what their expectations are. You can also kind of start to learn some of the technical language that they're going to be using. Really, if you can talk to someone in that field, even if it's, you know, just calling and talking to the hiring manager and being like, hey, I'm interested in working for your company. Could you tell me a little bit more about your company? There's nothing wrong with calling and asking questions like that. They'll either respond to you and carry on a conversation, or they'll be like, nope, sorry, I'm too busy. I can't answer those questions, whatever. But there's nothing that says you can't call and ask for more information as well. But certainly if you can work with someone who works in the field and ask them questions, oftentimes that's the best thing that you can do. That someday if you transfer to a university and they have a job fair or something like that, or opportunities to meet employers, by all means go. Just talking to people in situations like that is super helpful, just to kind of get a sense of what they're looking for. Other questions?
Well, it's good to ask them about what tools do they use at the job, so you can already understand good things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this is just the first step. Keep in mind your resume, your cover letter. This is really your first impression that you're making on the future employer. So you want it to be a positive one. You want to make sure you're professional, your tone is correct. You know, you paid attention to details, etc. So, you know, maybe they call you and schedule an interview, maybe they don't. But a lot of times this makes or breaks whether you get that first little invitation in the door. I would also strongly encourage you, before you go for an interview, let's say you get that phone call, go do some more research, learn what you can, try to talk to someone who works there if you know someone, or know someone who knows someone who knows someone. You know, oftentimes just having a little bit of insight can be super helpful. Also go into that interview prepared. Go back, look at your resume, look at your cover letter, take copies of those with you, print them out on nice paper, because you may want to leave copies behind with them. There's a heavier weight resume paper that you can get at the office supply store. I would encourage you, just go with like a very neutral color. It doesn't have to be anything flashy. It's a little bit more expensive, but if you leave a resume behind, it something that's a little thicker, heavier weight, if it gets passed around, it's helpful to have. But also go in with a list of questions. You know, they are interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing them. You know what your strengths are, you know what your abilities are. You really have to sell yourself, not just here on paper with the resume and the cover letter, but when you go into that interview. So be prepared, have some questions you want to ask them, like, hey, well, if I were to be hired, what's going to be probably the biggest challenge for someone new, you know, coming in fresh out of college? What can I expect to learn the first year? You know, will I have someone who will help, you know, mentor me, or can I shadow someone, or whatever the case may be? Go in. Don't ever sit in an interview and when they get to the point where they say, do you have any questions? Don't just say nothing. Have a question. I always encourage people, when you're going in for an interview, ask what the process is. I can't tell you how horrifying it is to go home and go, well, I wonder when I'm going to hear from them. I wonder if I will hear from them. If you ask during the interview, oftentimes they will tell you, hey, you know, we're looking to fill this position in the next month. Or, hey, this is just our first round of interviews. We still plan to do several more rounds of interviews over the next month. Whatever the case may be, there's nothing wrong with asking what the process is. I know the first time I applied here, I had done my homework, but I feel like I didn't do my homework quite as well as I needed to. I was shocked when my phone interview had 7 people on the call. That was like, whoa, wow, 7 people. Okay. And then when you show up and you do an in-person interview, you know, you have more people, and then there's still more interviews. You never know, you might have to provide a writing sample, or you might have to do some sort of test or other activity when you go in. So it's always good to ask questions. Also, I encourage you, if you get a call for an interview, keep in mind that when your wheels hit the parking lot, they are watching a lot of times. When I worked for a company in the corporate world, our receptionist was always our little snitch. She'd be like, hey, this person sat in their car for 20 minutes before they came in. Or hey, this person, you know, be nice to the people who greet you and welcome you when you first get there, because oftentimes they're part of that decision-making process too. Yes, they were nice, they were polite, they were friendly, you know, all of those things. So just kind of be aware of that too. The whole thing is part of the interview process oftentimes, and I think sometimes we don't realize that, especially when you're first coming out of college. Other questions?
Should you omit jobs for the sake of being more relevant?
I would say it's going to depend on how much information you have. So if you don't have a lot of work experience, I would say don't necessarily omit it just because you don't feel like it's relevant. Chances are you can probably think of something that you learned in a position, even if it doesn't tie directly to that field that you're applying for. So like, for example, I have a friend who, she has a teaching degree, and she's 10 years older than me, but she's never actually taught her own class. She graduated from college, she subbed for about 5 years, married, started having kids pretty quickly. And then a few years ago, once her kids went off to college, she decided, hey, you know what? I want to go back and I want to start teaching again. She's like, but I've never taught my own class. What am I going to do? I'm like, well, you've taught Sunday school. You were a Cub Scout leader, like things that you wouldn't necessarily think maybe have a direct relationship. Oftentimes you can talk about skills you learned or opportunities that you had to work with people or work on a team or manage people that you can talk about, even if it doesn't feel like it's necessarily relevant to a particular position. Thank you so much for having me today. My email address is on the board. If you would like to email me, if you have any questions that pop up after the fact. I told your advisor I'd be happy to, at some point, even next fall or whenever, come and work with you guys. If you have, you know, resumes that you want me to take a look at or anything like that, I'm happy to do that anytime for students. So just let me know if there's something I can. Yeah, sure. Sure. Absolutely.
Like right now.
Right now, I can do it right now. I don't have anything else this afternoon, so I can certainly do that right now if you'd like.
I asked Saul if you had any questions, but he didn't respond in the chat, so I'm assuming he's good.
Okay.
And our other attendee had to leave for work, which
Okay.
is, thank you so much.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for inviting me. I always love getting to talk to students, even when they're not my own students. So. Yeah. Thank you. And if y'all want samples of other resumes, I can give you other student samples.